Hello, everyone. This is recording number 5 for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean Ethics. Today's topic is how the virtues of character relate to pleasure and pain. In Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle turns to the virtues of character, and the roles of pleasure and pain belong to the most complex and much debated dimensions of his account. I'm going to focus in today's recording on Book 2, Chapter 3, where a lot of the relevant considerations come in. So, the very first sentence of this chapter mentions already an important idea, namely that people take pleasure in different activities. So, we might think, for example, someone takes pleasure in running and someone else takes pleasure in solving a math problem, let's say. Now, one premise that this provides us with is that people take pleasure in different activities. Another premise that it provides us with relates to how Aristotle conceives of, on the one hand, the activity of, let's say, running or solving a math problem, and the activity of pleasure. In somewhat technical terms, scholars tend to say that pleasure supervenes on the activity of, let's say, running or solving a math problem. So you have the proposal that people take pleasure in different activities, and the way that works is there's the activity such as running, and there is alongside it the activity of pleasure. Now, the second idea, which also comes up in the first sentence of chapter 3 of book 2, is that we can take the pleasure that people take in different activities as a sign for their dispositions. Now, what does that mean? Here, the thought is that, for example, if someone takes pleasure in virtuous actions, that is a sign that she is virtuous. Say, if a person takes pleasure in being kind to others, that is a sign that, in fact, she has the virtue of kindness. Now, the next idea that I want to mention is that, according to Aristotle, pleasure and pain have a role in correction. Here, the idea is that, let's say, in the context of raising children, a child might enjoy some activity. Let's say the child enjoys eating some chocolate, but in fact, it was her sister's chocolate. So she enjoys eating the chocolate, but then she does not enjoy that her parents are going to scold her. So there is the pleasure of doing something, and then there is the displeasure or pain of being blamed for it. And the thought is that this kind of relation between taking pleasure in something and taking displeasure in being blamed for it later on in life, when we are adults, takes place as it were in our own psychology. So, for example, you might think that, well, I should exercise regularly. But here you are finding yourself again lying on your sofa reading a book, let's say. So you enjoy the reading and the lying on the sofa, but you do not enjoy the fact that you scold yourself because you're telling yourself, I know that I should exercise and I'm not doing it. So you have kind of two layers here, as it were. You have the pleasure that you take in some activity, and you have the pain of blame. Now, let's add another premise that comes up in still the same chapter, chapter 3 of book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says, in a formulation that is very famous, that pleasure and pain are dyed into our psychology or lives or whatever. What does that mean? The thought is that it's as it were not an option for us not to be motivated by pleasure, because it is just the way the human mind works. That pleasure is something that we pursue and pain is something that we aim to get away from. And we cannot, as it were, tell ourselves, well, the perfect person does not pursue pleasure or things like that. That wouldn't make sense because it simply is a fact about us that we are motivated by pleasure. So let me summarize 4 ideas that I mentioned. One is people take pleasure in different activities, in any number of activities. Another idea is that we can treat the pleasure that they take in some activity as a sign for a disposition that they have. Another idea is that there is, in addition to the pleasure in some activity, also the pleasure of praise and blame, given that we find ourselves doing things that we either think we should be doing or not. And finally, there is the thought that we are not going to get away from pleasure as a motivator. That simply is part of the way in which the human mind works. All of this leads Aristotle to a conception of virtue that is really quite different from a fairly common modern assumption. The modern assumption is that the virtuous person somehow overcomes pleasure. Somehow she is able to withstand the temptation of pleasure, doing the right thing, even though she was tempted by pleasure. But Aristotle's idea is fundamentally different, namely that the virtuous person takes pleasure in virtuous action. And what that means is she is not tempted to do otherwise. What is pleasant for her is precisely what she should be doing. The virtuous or good action is really the action that she wants to do, that she enjoys to do. And I want to end this recording as it were with an invitation to consider this as 2 options, 2 really deeply different options to think about the relation between pleasure and virtue.